Hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming back with your sandwiches, and we're not sitting up here hungry or anything, but we hope to kind of keep the lunchtime entertaining over the next hour. The theme of this session is big efforts in education, and my name is Laura Savage. I'm the lead in DFID for RISE. And we set up RISE 5 years ago with the aim of looking for what Lant in one of the early vision papers called audacious reforms in education, with the recognition that the learning profiles that we're seeing, the learning trends that we're seeing, we are never going to reach the goals that the world has set by 2030. The rate of change that we need to see is so dramatic, and we are seeing nothing. We were 5 years ago seeing nothing out there that was telling us something's going to change. And so, no pressure on RISE at the start of the program or anything, but, you've got 8 years to tell us the answers of how to do it. And, practitioners, policymakers every year are saying to the 100+ people now involved with RISE, what are the answers? What do we do about it? So, in part, I'm going to pass that question over to the panel today to say, what are we doing about it? What are the big efforts in education? But I wanted to take some of the messages that I've been taking from the last couple of days and reflect on them at the start, because I feel that we're seeing some incredible experiments. We're seeing some incredible ideas being tested in education. We're still not seeing the massive learning gains, the dramatic learning gains that we're looking for. So we really, we want to be able to identify these trends, these ideas. I think we know a lot more, what I've heard. We know a lot more about what we shouldn't do. And I think if I asked each of you to think in your head right now, what are 3 things that we know we should no longer be doing in education, you can come up with those 3 like that, right? If I say to you, what are 3 of the things that we should be doing differently, it's slightly harder. And that's the challenge that I want to put to at least 2 of the panelists today. So I think Justin briefly introduced everyone at the end of the last session. That we're going to kick off with Penny Goldberg, who's Chief Economist at the World Bank Group. I'm sure needs no further introduction. But Penny's going to talk about some of the perspective of the World Bank on the big efforts that are being made by the World Bank in education and wider human capital. And I think that the way that we can integrate evidence into the choices that are made to support those big efforts. Margaret Irving, who is replacing Rafael Martinez, who's unfortunately unwell today, on the panel from the Global Partnership for Education, is similar in a also a role that is about embedding evidence into education change. And the Global Partnership for Education at the moment are the huge supporters of the big education sector plans in country, but there's a moment of reflection on how to get evidence into those. So Margaret's going to speak to that. And then we've got Bronwen Magrath, who I've worked with over the last couple of years on a sister program that DFID set up to RISE, which funds 30 grants on system reform ideas in education. And Bronwen's going to tell us the reflections on that, on how it is that we know whether the big efforts are working and how we research them, different system research methods that we're going to need to know whether what we're doing is having an effect. So I'm going to turn over. We're going to have 10, as ever, strict RISE minutes each for the presentations, and then we're going to open out to Q&A. So over to you, Penny.
Thank you very much, Laura. So let me start by extending a little bit the introduction. As Laura said, I'm the Chief Economist of the World Bank, but as you probably know, my background is not in human capital, it's not in human development. Actually, most of my research has been in trade and industrial organization. Nevertheless, when I decided to join the World Bank, part of my decision was based on the vision that the World Bank had at the time, which was the focus on human capital. I thought this was a very inspiring vision and one that I was very willing to join, and that's part of what inspired me. So even though my own background is not in human capital, I am very much on board with what people in this room and the World Bank are trying to accomplish. As you know, in the meantime, we have a new president. Many people ask me, what's the future of the human capital project in the World Bank? And to be honest, I cannot say for sure. It's too early to give a very clear answer. But what I will say for sure is that as far as I'm concerned, I will do everything in my power to make sure that this stays one of the main priorities of the World Bank in the near future. So with this introduction, let me say a little bit about what the World Bank has been doing in the last few years. The World Bank has had a long-run interest in human capital, not surprisingly. We all agree that human capital is one of the foundations of development. And I'm sure there are many people here who know the history much better, but one contribution that immediately comes to mind is the World Development Report of 2004 on service delivery for the poor. And at that time, the World Bank made the case that there are some services that are crucial for development, education and health were among them. And so that's many years ago, so more than a decade ago, the World Bank made the case very strongly for the need of education. Land, who was cited very, very extensively this morning, some of his early writings were actually while he was in the World Bank when he identified the learning crisis. More recently, the World Development Report of 2018 was also devoted to education, to learning, and the title, you don't need to read the whole report, just that if you read the title makes clear what the issue is, making learning work for learning to make sure that the education delivers on its promise. So making clear that there is a discrepancy between education as measured by years of schooling and learning. So there's a very long tradition of the World Bank focusing on these issues. More recently, all these efforts have been conducted under the umbrella of the Human Capital Project. And this Human Capital Project is a large-scale effort in the spirit that Laura mentioned to make a difference in the world. So the Human Capital Project has three components. One is the Human Capital Index. Another one is measurement, better measurement, collection of data. And the third one is engagement with the governments. So let me talk briefly about each of them and explain why we expect all these components to make a difference. The Human Capital Index is an index, as the term says. It's supposed to measure what the human capital of the future generation is going to be, so of people 18 years from now. So it's a forward-looking measure. Why forward-looking? Because the human capital of the next generation of people 18 years from now is going to be based on the investments we make today. And these are the investments that we can influence today. If we focus on the human capital today, this has already been determined by decisions that were made in the past. So it's supposed to be a measure that's really policy relevant. So the Human Capital Index, again, I will have to apologize. Many of you already know that, but just to be clear, the Human Capital Index, as defined by the bank, has three components. One is survival, one is health, and one is education. So as defined by the World Bank in the context of the Human Capital Project, the Human Capital Index doesn't cover just education, it also covers health. But for the purpose of this session, I will focus on education. So when it comes to education, the educational component measures or consists of two subcomponents. One is years of schooling, and the other one is the quality of schooling, the quality of learning. And this is something that Noam talked extensively about this morning. So the Human Capital Index itself has a very strong measurement component. So why introduce such an index in the first place? So the point of this index is to provide it for a very large set of countries, make it internationally comparable, very importantly, make it available for developing countries. And by doing so, provide an incentive for policymakers to engage in actions and investments that are going to improve human capital. So the main idea behind the index is to mobilize policymakers, to mobilize resources. As someone pointed out earlier today, so in the morning session, it's very similar in spirit to the Doing Business report and the Doing Business Index, and that has been associated with many controversies in the past. Coming from academia, I myself had initially very mixed feelings about such a project. Why? Because we are trying to provide a measure, one aggregate measure that is going to be comparable across the whole world. Needless to say, this poses enormous measurement problems, enormous issues of comparability across countries. And it's very easy to come up with many limitations that such an index may have. But having been at the bank for 7 months now, the one thing I can say for sure is that there is nothing that mobilizes policymakers more than an index. So there is this issue of competition that we economists often emphasize, that competition works. It certainly works in the political domain. And this is something that people have told me about before I joined the bank. I've seen that firsthand, that the index and the rankings that arise from this index, as academics, we may have second thoughts about them, but this is something policymakers care deeply about, including policymakers in the most advanced countries, in the United States, in France. Sometimes when I talk about the doing business reports, I actually ask people, now tell me, if you're in the United Kingdom or in the United States or France, why do you care? Do you think firms are going to look at this index when they try to make investment decisions? But they care. I can tell you that they care. And the same applies to the Human Capital Index. They do care. And perhaps Rwanda is not going to compare itself to Singapore. If you remember Noam's chart from this morning, Rwanda is near the bottom and Singapore is near the top. But countries tend to compare themselves to their neighbors, and they care deeply about where they stand in the rankings. So the idea behind this index was to give policymakers, and perhaps more importantly, give the opposition in their countries, give them something, give them a measure that they can focus on, and that will mobilize them, that will provide incentives to undertake the necessary investments in education. And a further motivation behind this approach is it's very hard for people in the World Bank or for educational experts or people who are very well-meaning to know what the reality is in each country. The policymakers know that best. So, let them make the decisions that are going to make a difference in their countries. But from the point of view of the World Bank, let's make sure we give them the motivation for doing so. So that was one important component of the Human Capital Project. The second component I mentioned is measurement. So we cannot improve on something until we can measure it. So the second component consists of better measurement. And the Human Capital Index itself involves measurement. So the harmonized learning outcome database that Noam described this morning is part of this effort. But there are many additional data collection efforts that are going on in the World Bank, in many different parts of the World Bank. So the service delivery indicators are one such effort. This has actually a very long tradition. I believe that it originated with the old World Development Report I mentioned in 2004. And the efforts were intensified after the more recent World Development Report on Education in 2018. And these indicators are supposed to deliver some measures of how well education works in many different countries. The data collection initially focused, it's still focused mainly on Africa. At this point, we have data for 9 countries, but there are plans to extend the data collection efforts, my time is up, to more countries. One complaint I hear sometimes is that this data is not widely available. I can promise you that there will be a database that will make this data more readily available, more easily accessible this coming fall. So this way you will have access to this data. An additional effort is the educational dashboard, which is very similar in spirit to what the service delivery indicators do, but they're supposed to have a better interface and also extended to many other countries. So this is just to give you a taste of the data collection efforts undertaken by the World Bank. And then the final component within this Human Capital Project is to actually engage in a series of micro-interventions in many different countries, in direct engagement with the countries and the governments in order to make a difference in these countries. And this I cannot describe in this session because there is simply too much going on. But there are, if I had time, unfortunately I don't, if I had time I could give you many concrete examples of World Bank interventions in many of these countries, micro-level interventions. Maybe these are not in the spirit of these big efforts that Laura mentioned. They are micro-interventions, but I would nevertheless mention them in this context because the components I talked about at the beginning, so the big effort through the Human Capital Index and measurement, these are supposed to provide only the motivation for the smaller scale interventions that actually make a difference. So this is the thinking right now at the World Bank. Unfortunately, I'm almost out of time, right? But as I said at the beginning, this is a project that's still very much alive in the World Bank, and I will do everything in my power to make sure that it stays alive in the next few years.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about education sector plans and the Global Partnership for Education at GPE, what we've started to think, how we started to think about them. So at GPE, we really support the development of education sector plans as a mechanism to drive sustainable systems changes. What do I mean by system changes? Well, we're thinking about policy change, behavioral change, differences in accountability. How do things actually get implemented on the ground? And I guess to come back to the original framing of the session, this is about big efforts. Why am I talking about planning when planning isn't particularly new? It's not something that countries have been doing for decades. I guess it really fits well in a session like this for me is because what we're starting to think about is how do we shift the paradigm around how planning is done? How, instead of having this rigid, mechanistic, input-based, heavy plan, do we shift to something that's more flexible, more adaptive, and more aware of kind of a diverse array of inputs and evidence that can be used? So that's the kind of framing, I guess. We, of course, need to come from some place that says we think plans are a good idea. And from what we can see, we do know that, or at least in theory, we think that they drive a number of important ideals. We think they reinforce country leadership. We think they help to develop an inclusive and participatory reform agenda. Based on evidence, they've proved to be pretty effective for mobilizing resources, both domestically and externally. They allow for better coordination and alignment, again, also both internally and externally, and also create a kind of framework for accountability across stakeholders. So we believe in plans, and we have seen that some things work well, right? So at GPE, we've undertaken a series of country-level evaluations. We monitor the quality of our sector plans. Overall, we've seen that the quality of plans has improved. There is greater use of evidence. I'll come to this shortly. Evidence does, however, still remain pretty narrowly defined, but there is more use of evidence and there are greater analysis and assessment. They seem to have very positive effects in building trust across various partners and stakeholders. And they also seem to be a really good lever for attracting aid into the sector. At the same time, like I say, there remain some problems. And what we see now is a very particular kind of culture of planning, a highly technocratic, input-based way of thinking about how to develop a plan. On the one hand, this is good because, like I say, we've seen greater belief in the importance of evidence, greater belief in the value of the plan. We also see that there is an increasing shift towards understanding how do we, weigh up affordability when we're developing priorities. But it's still quite a rigid culture, and we think there's more that can be done there. So where do we see some of the problems, and what are some of the areas where we think there needs to be change? I guess the shortcomings we can kind of frame into a couple of areas. We can look at what happens at the diagnostic stage of planning, what happens when there's design of strategies, what happens during implementation, and then what are the kind of overall implications for country leadership on plans. So if I quickly run through each of those, conscious of time. Like I say, in the kind of assessment or diagnostic stage, we see that the evidence that's used really isn't probably sufficiently diverse. We tend to rely on very simple data basic econometric measures. We're increasingly seeing understanding political economy, understanding behavioral aspects are really important to developing effective plans. We also see sometimes there isn't enough of a push to understand the why. So to give a very example of a flawed diagnostic that might happen, you might see, for example, that in a school, teachers find that they really benefit from, or report that they really benefit from having supervision sessions. But you feel like there aren't enough school supervisors, they're not getting enough time. So what's the solution? Well, the first level solution is get more supervisors in the mix, right? What you can see, though, oftentimes is if you take a kind of slightly deeper look at the problem, sometimes in those situations what's going on is the way that supervisors' time is spent is not appropriate. Too much time spent on administrative tasks, not enough time spent on pedagogical support. So by then making the recommendation that you get more supervisors in the mix without reforming that second piece, you're reinforcing an inefficient and ineffective system. So we really need to think a little bit more about how the kinds of evidence we use and what we do, and drawing on a broader array of evidence and drawing more on local knowledge. When it comes to strategies and policy design, one of the key issues I guess we see is that sometimes plans can kind of look like a wish list. They know what they're supposed to touch on, and they kind of, on paper, develop a way to get to absolutely everything that a country wants. But we know that what needs to happen is better prioritization, a better understanding of how do we sequence things, how do we cost things out, what do we need to do first, and how do we establish those priorities. Something else here is the need, again, to understand country context and the need to really have those solutions coming from within. You know, I think we often see, like I say, a very kind of standardized set of recommendations or policy proposals in ESP without efficient attention or sufficient attention to nuance and kind of the country context. So sometimes we kind of see a lot of business as usual. Occasionally we do see some innovation, but they tend to be very small scale innovations, not really drawing on what could work at large scale in this country in this context. I could talk a little bit more about that, but conscious of time, let me skip to implementation. This is a big challenge for us because we spend a lot of energy on the plan itself, and it's not always clear how does a good plan really drive effective implementation. So we'd like to understand those linkages a little bit better. But even more than that, we'd like to not see implementation as kind of a discrete phase. We would like to think of it as an opportunity to learn lessons, to be constantly building, to be reevaluating how do we do things differently, rather than a kind of discrete phase of the process. Also need to be thinking a little bit in the earlier stages about assessing feasibility for implementation. What really is the capacity of actors? How do we leverage what exists and build what doesn't exist to improve implementation? The last piece, I guess, where we see some challenges, I guess, is the country leadership piece. Oftentimes we know that development of education sector plans can be heavily reliant on international expertise and external actors. We know that the design process can sometimes be long and drawn out, and of course there are political processes that are going on in parallel, so we can have leaders changing in the middle of the development or design of a phase. And this kind of creates a challenge for, I guess, what you'd call ownership and continuity, because you want to have political ownership of the plan, but you also want to have continuity in the stakeholders who are engaged and feel ownership of the plan. So then moving down, I guess, to spend the last couple of minutes talking about where do we want to be, what do we want to change. A lot of these things are about really changing a kind of mindset around planning, or a culture of planning. And like I say, the idea is to be more flexible, more adaptive, more responsive, to build things like a culture of evidence, not based just on input data or assessing performance, but really understanding incentives, understanding appetite, understanding why there is resistance. We want to think a little bit more about how do we that the plan is realistic and actually has a strategy. Talk realistically about prioritization. How do we make a strategy for sequencing what needs to happen first and what should happen first? We want to develop more of, I guess, what we could call a learning mindset. So again, not just being stuck in this is an implementation phase, we have to wait until the end to understand what's happening. What do we do to build in feedback loops, to have this kind of ongoing process. And then also, what do we do around accountability? We've learned that we try to encourage accountability. We want to hold actors beyond just government responsible, but we also don't want to hold actors responsible for results where they actually have little influence over those results. So we really need to be thinking about that quite closely. At GPE, I think we've sometimes learned that the process of plan development can be very costly. Heavy transaction costs, it can be very process heavy. We want to think about how do we do that in a slightly lighter way, and how do we think about responding to countries who are in different places with respect to how effective they are at their own planning process. How do we build on what's already there rather than trying to superimpose something that's less effective? So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, but plenty more to say in the Q&A.
So I will take over from there. So as Laura said, my name is Bronwen, and I've been working with Laura and others on the Raising Learning Outcomes program, which is also an ESRC DFID funded program, considered sort of a sister program to RISE. It was launched in 2014. Is that echoey? Mm-hmm. Sounded echoey to me. It was launched in 2014 with the aim of building a policy-relevant evidence base on the factors that constrain learning outcomes in developing countries. And it's premised on a framework that sees learning outcomes in the center, influenced by three overlapping and sort of mutually reinforcing inputs, if you will. One is elements of a system, which is mostly teaching and assessment. The second is context, and the third is the dynamics of governance. So as Laura mentioned, a total of 31 grants, I believe, were funded in this program, and a few of the grant holders are here as well, because they're both sit in RISE and RLO. And the 31 are divided into 3 cohorts, a cohort for each one of those inputs, a cohort focused on teaching and assessment, one on context, and one on the dynamics of governance. In addition to that, there was a function called the Program Research Lead, which I was part of, along with my colleagues David Johnson and Manaza Islam at University of Oxford. So the Program Research Lead was tasked with mining the collective learning across the portfolio of 31 grants. So it was really about sort of identifying synergies, pulling those threads with the idea that the whole would be greater than the sum of its parts. So there was a few different things that we did as part of this work, but one of them was to look at the methods that are being used. We started with the research question of, like, how do you actually do systems research? The idea of this program is to investigate how researchers can contribute to a strengthening of education systems. How do you do that in practice? So we took a look across the grants to see what we could find, and to be honest with you, we don't really have a great answer. We found that most individual grants really struggled to reach these deeper questions about what systemic change is in education. And so as we attempted, though, to find that and to tease out some ideas, we did identify a few common challenges or common approaches across the grants, and we used those as a basis of exploring, well, based on that, what do we think we maybe need to know more about in terms of the methods and the toolkit of doing systems research? So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So one of the big areas, and I think is worth flagging, is that the RLO, one of the sort of requirements for proposals was that there was a mixed method approach. So it's maybe a little bit different than RISE, although I don't know as well that, but so all of the grant holders were, although there were a lot of RCTs and impact evaluations, there also had to be sort of a qualitative element in some ways to those, to have a sort of mixed method approach. So one thing that was interesting was how people challenged themselves with that, or the different challenges of having genuinely mixed methods, and we talk about that quite a bit in the paper. But today, in the interest of time, I'm just going to zoom into 2 sort of smaller sub-issues. One of them is the challenge of context, of knowing if it works here in this school or this country, will it work elsewhere? And the second is the sort of tenuous link between social accountability and learning outcomes. And do they relate to each other? Are they mutually reinforcing? If they are, how do we know? Which is another key question that emerged in quite a lot of RLO research. So I'm going to talk about each of those. I'll start with talking about context. So the question of whether intervention, if it works here, will it work there, That's not unique to systems research. That's a question that is fundamental, I would say, to comparative and international development and comparative education, and probably to all sort of policy-oriented research. So many projects in the RLO program, because they're looking at what constrains or challenges learning outcomes, a lot of them involve some type of learning assessment test or tool. And so a lot of them are challenged by, if we use this tool that was developed for this context, will it work in this context? Or we're doing a study across multiple countries, will our tool travel across those countries? And they were challenged by both the sort of conceptual or linguistic equivalence as well as equivalence of measurement across those settings. So we looked a bit, how are some of the different grant holders handling that challenge? So we found a few different ways, and one of them was to make tools that are like very highly adaptable and flexible to different cultural situations. So a few indicative examples, just to illustrate if I have the time. Research led by Ed Seidman at NYU on a teacher observation tool, and another project by Yanti Simply, led by Simply from Cambridge, was looking at multilingualism and multiliteracy in India. And in both of those cases, they developed these tools where they were highly contextualized to the locale that they were in. They were very flexible in terms of the language that they used in the test, the cultural reference points. So that made it, of course, that gives a degree of cultural relevance, but it's also a really heavy lift to design tools like that, and it compromises a little bit data comparability and reliability. So a very different approach that is used by some of the grant holders is to make a tool that's really simple and prescriptive to ensure that it's reliable and comparable across these settings. So an example of this, some of you may be familiar with the work from NYU Global Ties, a racer tool, which is like a tablet-based test of executive functioning. Very, very simple. The instructions, everything is done through pictures. There's no language, there's no words used, so it can be used, across different locales. The language or literacy level of both the kids taking it and the person giving the test is not a factor. Also, I was thinking of Nick Spall, I know is in the room, and his team, one of his colleagues at Stellenbosch, wrote an article for our special issue about their assessment tool used across schools in South Africa, and that they made it very, very low inference in order that it could be used by the enumerators or by the field workers, regardless of sort of the quality or skill level or training that was used. So there were some different methods like this used. But the question of context and how assessment tools or other methods are used across different locations seem to us very crucial to this how-to question of systems research, because it helps us move from a specific intervention to something maybe more broad and more systemic, but also because there was an implied idea of scale in a lot of the research that we were looking at in the RLO, and that sort of means how are these tools going to travel on our journey to scale. So as I said, we don't have any tight answers yet, but it would be really interesting to hear from RISE researchers and others in the room how they are grappling with that. How am I doing? Oh, I should move along. Okay, so I'll move on to the second issue, which is around social accountability. And there is the third cohort of RLO researchers are looking at the dynamics of governance and accountability, a heavy emphasis on social accountability and sort of mechanisms of social accountability. And although it's early days, because this is the third cohort, I think they're about a year-ish into it, maybe a little bit more than that. So they're early on in their research process. So for us looking in at their research, only very tentative ideas can be drawn out at this point. But we could loosely clump them into two camps, if you will. One, we're looking at improved accountability through participation and governance, and another at improved accountability through information, either access to information or through participatory, being involved in gathering or generating the information. So methodologically, a lot of these interventions in both sides were drawing from the toolbox of participatory research methods. So we had several, I won't get into detail because I know I don't have tons of time, but several who were doing, getting workshops together with learners, with teachers, with parents, community members, school leaders, to try to craft strategies or to try to identify barriers for kids with disabilities. So there was a lot of very participatory research methods going on. So we were asking, how does that fit with systems approaches to research? Is this an important component? Is it worth thinking on? And we've landed on sort of three tentative ideas here.
So one is that the participatory research methods can really help highlight or maybe help us observe the very complex dynamics, relational dynamics of different actors in different contexts, and that may help uncover an aspect of systems research which is otherwise difficult to get to. Another, I guess, fairly maybe obvious or fundamental idea is that the social accountability and participatory research methods helps grapple with ideas of equity in education by ostensibly giving a voice to communities who perhaps are marginalized in educational decision-making. Will that help strengthen not only their learning outcomes, but also the broader efforts at improving social accountability through participation? And then finally, tentatively, we thought perhaps these participatory methods could improve the coherence of the system, with the idea that maybe if you have people, different diverse stakeholders with competing ideas in the room, to hash out where they are going or what their strategy or plan or how they're going to assess the learning or whatever it is, depending on the project, are we able to get to a situation where there's more agreement, where people can get more on the same page, where the demands children or parents are placing on teachers are similar to the demand the school leaders are placing on teachers? We're not sure, but this is tentative, as I said, tentative ideas that we have about the links between participatory research and systems research. So I know I'm out of time. So I'll just throw it out by reiterating that from our perspective, looking and reviewing across the RLO portfolio, we struggled to see what one intervention is giving us in terms of understanding systemic change in education. And we wondered whether, in fact, it's programs like RISE and like RLO, where you have a large, diverse body of research, where you can mine across or pull threads across either people working in a similar theme or a number of researchers in a given country, and whether looking in that way is going to be able to get us closer to understanding what sort of conceptual framing or methodological framing we need to understand systems research. I'm going to pause because I'm out of time and turn it over to Laura. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there's a huge amount to come back on and huge amounts more to say. But I'm quite interested that there are some, the big ideas we've heard. Contextualize education within a human capital narrative is one huge shift. And it's certainly something, if I had 10 minutes, I could give you the spiel on how DFID's trying to do that. And I think in a very different way, the narrative is quite different from that in the bank at the moment. Ditto the idea of a paradigm shift, which is, I think, fairly similar to what RISE is attempting to achieve. But what does that mean? What is it? And Margaret's outlined that, at least for GPE, at the initial planning stage, that is about moving from a fairly linear input-driven process into something that is much more kind of flexible and iterative. And I think I'd be really interested to hear if that's something that is reflected in practice as well as planning. So, and then I think there's a whole set of questions almost thrown out to the room on how do we actually grapple with some of this stuff, because it feels like the methodologies that we've got at the moment are giving us certain answers. Certainly from the kind of policy perspective, that echoes the kind of experience that we've had. So I'm going to open it out and take buckets of 3. Introduce yourselves so that we know everyone knows who each other are, and then we'll come back for more.
Hi there, I'm Marla Spivak. I'm with the RISE Directorate. My question's for Penny on the Human Capital Index. So you mentioned that it's similar to the doing business indicators in some ways, and that indices can be a great motivator for policymakers. One of the concerns with the doing business indicators is that it focuses attention sometimes in the wrong things, some people have said. So how are you thinking in the bank about helping use the Human Capital Index to focus policymaker attention on the right things?
I'll take a cluster. There's another one there from Joe as well.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Joe DeStefano from RTI. I appreciate the panel. My question is for the GP. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. I know you're not Raphael. But you talked about the focus on planning and then listed a whole number of ways that is falling short of some of what the GPE and others would like to see. And I think something that you didn't talk about at all is the degree of variability within GPE programs as you travel around the world and interact with them, that I'd like to hear more about maybe some accountability within the GPE for how their programs play out in terms of implementation in particular.
Do you want to kick off with those two? Sure. So about the Human Capital Index, I mean, you're right that sometimes these indices motivate policymakers to take up the issue, but then they focus on the wrong things. I actually think that for the Human Capital Index, the issues may be a little easier than they are with the doing business, in the sense that to the extent that you are trying to improve learning, I would think there is very little disagreement that learning is important. This is something we need to focus on. So then the question is, do we really measure learning the right way? So then you can focus the whole effort on trying to measure something correctly. So my approach towards this is, let's do the best job we can in measuring learning. This is a challenge not in cross-country comparisons. This is also a challenge for every school itself. So let's try to do the best job we can. We can have a very long and interesting debate on whether tests really capture learning. I will leave it to another time. But assuming that they do, that there is a correlation at least between testing, test performance, and learning, you can harness all this information that's out there to measure learning. So that's part one. Part two, there are always going to be some concerns and some disagreement. Then make measurement and make the data and the methods as transparent as possible. Put everything on the website, and by everything I don't mean just the aggregate data, I mean the micro data. Make the methods clear. Maybe we're not getting everything right, but then the hope is that someone else will come along and will improve. And the issues are important, they're crucial. So given that they're important, people should work on them. So this is an invitation for all of us, for everyone, to actually work on this issue. So that's my approach.
It's great. So to speak to GPE and accountability, particularly around implementation, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of variation in particularly the implementation phase of programs. And as a starting point, I guess two different things to observe. One is that I think internally at GPE, we've recognized that we haven't been as good as we would like to be at following through on implementation. We have a lot of focus on the plan, and we realize now that we need to think a lot more about what do we do to make sure that the implementation actually reflects what is planned. So we're trying to put more emphasis on things like joint sector reviews, more regular engagement, and trying to say, to the extent possible, think of is there a way to kind of see this implementation as a learning opportunity? I think in terms of accountability, the one thing that's also come out of one of our recent review is that the whole model of GPE is about a partnership. It's not just GPE as where I sit in the secretariat, but it's about a cross-section of partners, all of whom need to be held to account for different elements of delivery. And what we're trying to push on a little bit more is, instead of just seeing, kind of separating GPE as a separate entity, really kind of going back to what the driver for starting GPE was, which was essentially kind of like a hub to bring together all these different partners to better coordinate and really try to hold others to account within the model. As an organization or as a secretariat, it's unrealistic to assume that we will be able to do all of that. We really want to think about how do we engage our partners better and really set parameters for what accountability looks like for those individuals. Sorry, I'm giving a very general response in the interests of time, but I guess it's those two things. It's more focus on the implementation, and it's a lot of focus on what partners should be doing, and both internally within countries and external partners, those who engage in different ways, because those different accountabilities and the lack of follow through on them in some instances but not in others is why you see this hugely different variation in the result.
Penny, can I just pick up on the point you made at the end of your presentation about the micro interventions that are being tried as the third part of the Human Capital Project? I mean, I think here when we're talking about big efforts, we're not talking, yes, we need scale in terms of dramatic, fast improvements for all, and there is a huge amount of bigness to that. But I think there's also a definition of big that is different. Is what we're looking for here in education something that is different, something that is akin to a paradigm shift that means that the ways that we've been working, the accumulated knowledge over over the last couple of centuries needs translation in a way that is different to before. Are any of the micro-interventions that are happening as part of that sort of third wave of the third part of the HCP, do they indicate a different way of working in education or the other sectors?
So you're asking if there are any concrete interventions. There are some examples I could give you. So one is this idea of linking financing to performance, to results. It seems kind of obvious, but I think it is novel in the sense that there is still a tendency, not just in education, in development, to measure success by inputs, by how much money we dumped on a problem without actually measuring success. And I think there is a shift in paradigm there by trying to first judge success by results, but also linking inputs, linking financing to results. So there is one example in Indonesia, so in Jakarta, where the World Bank convinced the government to offer a 20% reward to 20% of the grant to each school, a 20% reward to those schools that showed good learning outcomes. And the impact evaluation showed that there were some positive outcomes, some positive impacts on learning. This was a small program. This was just a pilot. But on the positive side, that convinced the government to scale it up at the national level. So this is, one example where the financing is linked to results. In this case, to learning. Another case, where you could say we learned from experience, regards textbooks. And textbooks. So Eduardo talked earlier today about the fact that when it comes to certain interventions, the evidence is very mixed. I think when it comes to textbooks is one of these cases where some studies show positive effects and some studies show negative effects. And it turns out, that's my reading of the evidence, that sometimes the reason you find negative effects or no effects is because the textbooks never reached the students. They were stashed somewhere in the school and the students never got them. So there is the World Bank cooperated with Cambodia, I think. Let me check my notes. Yes, to make sure that there is a track and trace system. So the textbooks actually reach the students. They're not just put in the storage room of a school. And the reason the way this works is school officials actually go to the classrooms and ask the students whether they receive the books. These are very small scale interventions, but they were informed by the experience of the past. And they seem to be making a difference. So,
thank you. Okay. Can I open up for another round of questions? There's one over here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Stroches from Oxford Policy Management. My question is for Bronwen, but perhaps relevant for all of us to think about as well. I just wondered who the audience is meant to be for these outputs from the project you talked about, and more generally, the assumption in a lot of the research that we do is that it's the lack of information or evidence that's driving some of the bottlenecks affecting systems change. In your experience with the outputs that are coming, are you finding that policymakers and decision makers are actually using these complex and nuanced findings to make decisions towards addressing these systems challenges?
Thank you. Big one. There's two more. I'll take Noam and then Anne.
A question for Penny. I'm just curious if any of the lessons and research from trade that you've done you think is applicable to human capital, if there's any kind of related insights from that literature and work that might apply.
Anton, just behind you.
Actually, I don't so much have a question as a comment, but I'll phrase my comment. Yeah, sorry, my name is Anton de Grauwe from UNESCO IIEP. but I'll phrase my comment in such a manner that it's sufficiently provocative that if you disagree, you can disagree with it. I think that the title of the session finally is big efforts. It's not different efforts, it's big efforts. And I think the difficulty we have is that an education system is unavoidably decentralized. Education happens in tens of thousands of classrooms. And once we think about big efforts, we feel that these big efforts have to be defined either at national level through education sector plans, or even at global level, because finally the dashboard and so on are global efforts. And in order to translate them into the classroom, we need to go through the administration. We need to go through the bureaucracy of an education system. We can't do anything else, because finally a national policy only exists if it is implemented in the classrooms. And I have the impression that we have considered the bureaucracy as a constraint. We have considered that the bureaucracy is resisting reform, and therefore we are imposing more and more accountability, we are imposing more and more measurement and so on. And I'm a bit worried, because I think in many cases that what the bureaucracy needs is support. It does need much more support towards reform rather than simply holding it accountable and simply having more measurements of its ineffectiveness. And I would like to hear a bit your response to that.
Excellent. Bronwen, should we start with you and then Penny?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So I think, it's supposed to be policy-oriented research, yes, the RLO. So policymakers are ultimately one of the target audiences, if you like, for the interventions, although it's also academic research in its own right. So that would be the target. Are policymakers taking it up? I don't know. I suppose we can all think of examples of really great, sound, very clear and obvious research where it's not being taken up and you're banging your head against a wall. But then I think there are other ways to look at whether something is being taken up. So I was thinking after you spoke about the area of disability and intersecting disadvantage, which is a cross-cutting theme across a lot of the research in the RLO program. And I can't say that you can point to a specific policy decision or reform that has come out because of this research. But I do feel that it is part of a broader discourse on recognizing multiple intersecting disability and disadvantage and centering our ideas of what a good learning outcome is on equitable outcomes, equitable quality outcomes. And so I think this is, there's part of shifts underway, but to point to a specific policy decision, I think is very challenging. I should note that there's an impact initiative is another wing of the RLO, and there's many competing is not the right word. There's many branches that can be difficult to distinguish. But one of the things the impact initiative is tasked with is to help the researchers translate their findings into nice policy sound bites. And I suppose you'd have to ask Pauline Rose about her feelings of the success on that.
Thank you. Penny, do you want to pick up the trade question and then the provocation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So my first reaction is I cannot think of two fields that are more different than trade and education, in the sense that trade, almost by definition, tends to be big. So every intervention, every research effort tends to be big, in the sense that you go after the big questions. How do you open up an economy? How do you transform markets and so on? And it doesn't focus on people. We tend to work with highly stylized models that most people find very unrealistic. And then, some reasonable voice have argued for years, maybe you need to bring the human factor in, and maybe you need to take into account the context, right? That all these trade policies do not happen in a vacuum. You need to focus on the particular case that these policies are applied to. On the positive side, when it comes to developing countries, the beauty, if you want, of trade, of opening up, is you can circumvent many of the constraints we are talking about now, especially the big bureaucracy constraints. So you start with a premise. In some of these countries, you're faced with a mess. You don't know where to start. And perhaps the only thing you can do is open up these economies, open the borders, import not just goods, but also institutions or human capital. You just open your borders, and because this is the only thing you can do. So this is the thinking in trade. And here, I think many people come much more from the people focus side of research from micro interventions, and we're asking the question, so what are the general lessons we can draw from all these micro interventions? And are there lessons, or are there any commonalities? Is there external validity to all this work? So somehow, we're coming from very different perspectives. I could go on and on. Of course, human capital is important for trade. But that's another angle.
And Margaret, did you want to come back to Anton?
Briefly, on one element, just to respond to the one element. So I think I see 2 different points. I think you're right about this high-level stuff. Where the change is really affected is at the low level in the classroom. But I wanted to respond particularly to your point about the fact that we continue just to provide bureaucrats with evidence of inefficiencies, because it reminds me of another provocative comment that a colleague of mine made a couple of days back, because I work a lot on data, and he said, you've got a big problem in data. And I was like, what's that? And he was like, nobody wants it, because oftentimes it's bad news. So we all talk about getting more and more data. He was saying this to be provocative to you, not necessarily as a illustration. But there's something in there, because we do tend to use evidence and data more as stick than as carrot. And there's something in there about changing that mindset, because people tend to see, we're getting this data to evaluate my performance, not we're getting this evidence to understand how to do something better. And I know it sounds a little naive, but I do think there's some important behavioral piece in there that we have to work on to get to this kind of different mindset about what is all this evidence good for and what is all this data good for. So specifically on that point, I think you're absolutely right with the way we do things now. We tend to use evidence in a particular kind of way, but there has to be a shifting mindset about what it's good for and how we use it. That's part of the solution, I think.
Nice to end on. Thank you. So thank you, Penny, Margaret, and Bronwen, for your wisdom today, and thank you, everyone, for sharing your lunch with us. We'll stop here and move on to the next panel. Thank you.